So welcome everyone to our final session in the Buber seminar of the German Philosophy Seminar this year. I'm very delighted that you are all here today. Towards the end, Vic and I will make a few concluding remarks about the series as a whole, and we'll also be looking forward to some meetings that we're going to plan around the work for the special issue that we're going to produce. So that's for the end of the session. But for the bulk of the session will now be devoted to exploring the relation, the place of art and aesthetics in Buber's dialogical philosophy. I'm very happy that we're able to conclude with that topic. We have previously looked at, in the first semester, we looked at the dialogical philosophy as such. And then we looked at various areas to which it can be brought into a relationship, politics, ethics, psychotherapy, feminism, and now art and aesthetics. And we're doing that by having two guest speakers, Artemis Ignatido and Michael Benedict, both, of course, long-standing participants of the seminar. Welcome, Artemis and Michael. I'm very, very happy that you have taken it upon yourselves to present your ideas around some of these aspects that have to do with art and architecture. We will run the session as follows. First, Artemis will speak, and then we'll have a discussion about her paper, and then Michael will speak. We'll have a discussion about his paper, and then we will conclude the series. So we'll start with Artemis and then Michael. So Artemis Ignatido, for those of you who do not know her, is an early career cultural historian working on what she calls the social afterlife of Western art music in Europe. She's a former fellow of the Bloch Center and teaches piano, music theory, music history. And Artemis will consider Buber's aesthetics in the light of contemporary art and some considerations about Buber's development. So Artemis, maybe I could give the floor to you.
Yes, thank you so much. First of all, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Johan, and thank you, Vic. I will be sharing my PowerPoint, which means that I won't be able to see any of you. So if anything goes wrong, please give me a shout. And also that means that sometimes I will be making some awkward jokes and then laughing with them on my own because I won't be able to see you. So I will take it upon myself to do the whole show. Yeah. So let's start with and goodbye. I'll see you at the end. Let's see how it goes. PowerPoint share. So you're saying this and that. Oh, lovely. Let's see how it works. So when I started thinking about Buber's relationship to art and aesthetics, I quickly became overwhelmed, not only because of the breadth of his work, but predominantly by how deeply his personal relationship to art manifested itself throughout his texts. A systematic reading of all his works for the extraction of a singular theoretical strand would take significantly more time than I had, and therefore my first reaction was absolute fear, panic, despair, shame, and all the rest of it. But then, one evening, as I was snooping around his personal correspondence, I chanced upon a letter he wrote to Paula Winkler in 1901, at the age of 23. And I quote, and it's not working, yes. It has become painfully evident to me that I must pull myself together with all my strength, and in the next few months must accomplish something. Otherwise, I shall lose the last remnant of my artistic initiative, and without that, all technique is like a bird without the strength to fly. You must understand, dearest, that this is a matter of life and death. What is at stake is simply my art. If I let myself go, I go to seed. Then I can go on shaping myself as a university lecturer and as a decent individual in general. But it will all be over with the making of living things. This last phrase, the making of living things, affected me very deeply because suddenly a new perspective formed itself out of the chaos of Buber's creative practice. Today, I will attempt a work-in-progress reading of the aforementioned phrase and use it alongside another very interesting phrase that we shall encounter shortly as a way into Martin Buber's extensive work on creativity, community, nationalism, art, and the genuine path to the self. There, I will hand the microphone to Michael Benedict for his own reflections on Buber's dialogical work on art. Through this talk, I hope to receive feedback on the quality of these ideas, but also to start a discussion on the potential contemporary applicability of Buber's personal and professional creative ethos. With these aspirations in mind, I have modestly titled today's talk, Martin Buber's Manifesto. So from the viewpoint of the present discussion that has set Buber's personal relationship to art as the main analytical prism of his work and his life, perhaps the most important question is, art for whose sake? I will test this question against two different settings in Buber's life. Firstly, I will test it against Daniel, Buber's 1913 work on realization, which I have come to understand as one of those works in Buber's output that delivered a significant portion of their argument through their form. Secondly, I will test it against Buber's creative Zionist activism in order to understand how what I understand as a set of significant inhibitions to free creativity, that is propaganda and nationalism, affected the way Buber situated himself and his practice. In the article that I may or may not write in the future, I shall attempt a third reading, that of his retreat into abstraction in his theoretical considerations of art as dialogue. A commonly secret pleasure for most historical musicologists and art theorists I know is to actively look for the negative press a fundamental work received at some point in its history in order to understand its merits. So imagine my pleasure when I found the following 1965 review for Daniel in the Conservative Commentary magazine, where an openly hostile Isaac Bashevis Singer attacked Buber's branch of secular Judaism, as well as his choice of poetic delivery. Here, I will quote only his criticism on style. Some consider Martin Buber a poet, some a philosopher, others a mystic. Almost all agree he is an unclear thinker. Because Buber is so obscure, each new book inspires the hope that finally the master will elucidate his position. Such hopes are again defeated when one reads Daniel. Those who call Buber a poet seem to be nearest to the truth. He writes about philosophic and mystical themes in a poetic prose from which, at best, a kind of metaphysical eclecticism emerges. All his duties are in the realm of thought. It is finally a mysticism only for a cosmopolitan intellectual elite. So leaving aside the intellectual, spiritual, and certainly political differences between the two men, and focusing on the covert accusations about form, it becomes clear that what both friends and foes were consistently criticizing Buber for was his practice of sacrificing clarity for the sake of bourgeois, romantic, poetic delivery. So in this first part, I will give you a quick overview of Daniel, the first three dialogues, with some of my own remarks about what this work can tell us about Buber, and how this is a piece of work that was the outcome of the principles it preached: focus, form, power, and realization. What Martin Buber, I believe, would call a living thing himself. To give you some context on the intellectual beginnings of this piece, it is a response and an homage to Nietzsche's Zarathustra, which affected Buber fundamentally since his student days in the early 1900s, so 13 years before it was written. So dialogue number 1 is concerned with direction, form, and unity. When lost in a sea of infinite possibilities and potentialities, says Daniel, one can but focus on locating the one direction, the true direction towards the self, that will allow them to become at peace with the raging forces of conflicting emotions, tensions, and directions in the world. If they focus their intentionality towards experiencing the world as it is and becoming one with it, this direction towards the self will become powerful and transformative. Direction, intentionality, and the rebirth of the self are brought together through the myth of the descent of Orpheus to Hades. The musical example in this case serves not only the practical dimensions of allegory, in contrast to Dionysus, who was consumed by ecstasy, Orpheus descended to Hades decided, in quotes, his instrument with him intentionally, as Buber remarks. But also, this allegory establishes another tangible allegorical example. Music is the pure word of the directed soul, says Daniel. And his companion asks in response, so direction is then the inner song. Song, an invocation and a spell, is the vocal and oral manifestation of the self that will guide it through the world through creative logos. The self will be enticed by the power of its own melodious voice and follow it forward through the snares of the world and out of the underworld. All potentiality is located within the ability of the self to sing itself to freedom. Well, whether this song is always consonant or whether there is space for dissonance, and in that case, whether we like dissonant songs and what we do with them, we never learn. But the next dialogue sheds some more light into the properties of this inner human melody. In the second dialogue, it is again a powerful opening musical vignette that sets the stage. Above the hubbub of the city, Daniel and his new companion Ulrich are encountered with the collective song of a rumbling humanity that cannot hear itself sing. Daniel's insight from this experience concerns the knowledge derived from the overwhelming sensation of receiving and accepting the people's song and becoming himself muted and immobile with grief and loneliness. The teaching here is about realization and creativity, both of them central tenets in Buber's thought. The creative man, he who extracts from reality the essence of his experience and transforms it into knowledge, wins his substantiated place into this world that he has perceived and realized. As a consequence, reality is not understood as the sum total of the perceived existing realities, but rather as the relationship with the world and knowledge that the realizing man has extracted from the world. Consistently with his general practice of introducing a new idea with an example from the arts, Buber ushered in his definition of realization through the relationship between reality and poetry. Like the poet, who meets his hero in language and carries this encounter within him for the rest of his life, as a fragment of his lived experience, so is the realizing man, he who creates experience, he who can relate experience unto itself and create reality. In the last section of the dialogue, Buber brought all these previous ideas together to deliver a terrible verdict upon his society. In contrast to the realizing man, the maker, who has such concentrated creative power that he creates reality for all, the noisy, unredeemed city below him is populated by imitators, the pet children of appearance, those who do not realize, but they merely navigate life through second-hand experience. In dialogue number 3, Buber adds a number of descriptive parameters to the concepts of realized knowledge and direction that ultimately contribute to the production of meaning in human life. In a state of distress, Reynold confides in Daniel about the sudden disorientation, insecurity, and fear he experienced upon parting with the certainties of childhood. Daniel takes this opportunity to confirm that insecurity, risk, and adventure guide him whose primary aim is to live a realized life and experience the realized species of knowledge. Humans who operate on solid certainties and assumptions hide behind the falsely constructed Weltanschauung and merely ignore the forces of real life beyond it. And please make a note of this opinion because it will return later on. Contrary to this, the man of direction lives his life following his intuition into the unknown. He chooses his companions with his whole being and ultimately achieves a life that is meaningful in its constitutive elements. Thus, meaning, Daniel says, is not externally assigned, but manifests itself in the things we make, much like the painting is the realized form that reflects the painter's intuition and becomes an aspect of his experienced reality. So to give you a small practical example, of what I believe is a practical example, I spent my first quarantine eating ridiculous amounts of Kinder chocolate, the small bars. And out of this very deep experience, I created my very own Kinder vest.
Brilliant.
It is great. I know. Thank you. And the back is really nice as well. This is my Kinder vest. So I took my experience, I reflected upon it and realized it, and now I live dressed in garbage. So great. I don't know. I love my new vest. So if it screeches a lot, let me know, because I hear it's a bit more noisy than I anticipated. Anyhow, beyond being a mystical work and root to his mature output on dialogue, this piece of philosophical poetry that Daniel is could well stand as Buber's creative manifesto about creativity. Only instead of writing a descriptive methodological article, like any decent human being and maybe an aspiring scholar could have done, true to his devotion to form, Buber delivered it as an extract of knowledge deriving from his perceived and realized experience as a realizing man. The creative man, he who can relate experience upon himself and extract knowledge out of this encounter between the self and the world, is the one-eyed king who can create reality for his myopic imitators, who rely on second-hand experience to navigate life. In order to access the creative core of the self, a person has to focus on their unique sense of direction and trust, honor, and realize it. In this way, a new sensory compass, a feeling for knowledge, may be developed and provide our creative specimen with the ability to realize experience for himself and his fellow humans. The realized life, the adventurous life that follows the creative instinct and recognizes allies and enemies through sensory reflexes, may feel precarious, but it is ultimately rewarding in the knowledge of its intuitive direction towards the authentic life in society. Therefore, with regards to this section and Buber's first significant piece of philosophical work, the answer to our title question, for whom the fruits of art, may invite a variety of interconnected replies. Art as direction in the world, and art as the power that leads to the self. Art, as in poetic delivery, for the sake of the creative self, and art for the sake of the artwork. Art for responding to Nietzsche's art, and art for reinforcing the truth of the content with the truth of the form. Most significantly, art, both in terms of content and in terms of form, as a method and a process for intellectual inquiry. Whatever Buber's instincts were with regards to his personal relationship to art and his choice of style, his mode of delivery was a conscious choice that partly responded to and participated in a pre-existing literary culture, and partly it proposed this mode of delivery as a valuable method of inquiry for the future. The method is hardly new in the humanities. If anything else, many 19th century males of the letters could afford financially and professionally to follow their intuition and propose paradigm-shifting methodologies across the humanities. The proposition of this process as a widespread practice in UK universities could give birth to a new practice whereby students could be encouraged to experiment with literary styles, propose forms that diverge from the standard essay format, and borrow methodologies from across the arts and humanities. Already in the arts, self-reflective performance practice is accepted as research when and if a sufficient methodology can be provided, and the output can take any form that matches the intended message. A similar process in the humanities would see widespread artistic and philosophical training between sister disciplines, literature, theater, music, history, sociology, and philosophy, and training beyond instruction in the correct form of essay. In the controlled and safe environment of the university, students could take creative risks, develop their literary and artistic intuition, and create knowledge out of interdisciplinary experiments in form, content, and approach. In Buber's poetic language, the university could become that place where the sound of humanity is not a cacophony of directionless or market-oriented general knowledge, but a self-created melody that will lead students to realize their own future through creative practice. Among the people who gave Buber feedback for Daniel at the time of its conception was Gustav Landauer, who, upon commenting on the manuscript, had an interesting suggestion to make. What I'm asking you to do is to pour this dialogue into another mold. You should not rest content with contemplating the results within yourself artistically but placidly and reproducing what you have seen in your own psyche. You should be stirring us more powerfully, more dynamically. So inspiring as Buber's prose was and capable of speaking to his friend with truth and beauty, it nevertheless exhibited the characteristics of the self-indulgent kind of artist. Indeed, it did. But also this aspect of Buber's relationship to art belonged to a separate but interconnected period of his life, which had emerged before creativity had reclaimed a life for its own sake. The time when Martin Buber spent invested in the potency of art and culture as propaganda. The second phrase that will navigate us through this exploration of the question of art in Buber's thought originates again in one of his letters to Paula Winkler. A year earlier than his existential angst about making living things in 1899, the 21-year-old Martin Buber wrote to her from the Third Zionist Congress in Basel. Of the various choices that were offered me, I have chosen the propaganda committee, because that is what I love, communicating movement. Buried deep into his speeches to the Neue Gemeinschaft, I'll be saying German things all over the place, so please excuse me for that. So buried deep into his speeches to the Neue Gemeinschaft, a commune of bohemian writers and artists who had chosen art over dogma in the footsteps of Goethe and Novalis, we find the key to the meaning of this florid formulation. In this vision about modern individuals, Buber argued that they would be people who are equally happy to give and to take, because both are the same action, one from the mover, the giver, and one from the one being moved, receiving. This lived reciprocity of whole and solid individuals would form the basis for their resolution to be united by a common bond for the sake of greater freedom. Communicating movement can thus be interpreted as his creative, practical urge to promote this spirit of reciprocity among individuated individuals towards the creation of a healthy, productive, modern Jewish civilization. Which takes me back to the place where this interesting formulation was born, the Zionist Congress. Maurice Friedman tells us that immediately before Buber found solace in the cause of Zionism, his poetry was the lonely cry of a creative soul without purpose. Maurice Friedman also tells us that Zionism and the rebirth of Jewish culture became for Buber the cause that let his creative juices flow. In the cause of Zionism, which Buber understood as the chance for a new secular Jewish national consciousness, he found a new artistic path, an inspiration, and a cause for the development of his creativity. As you all probably know better than me, Buber took a leading part in the cultural unfolding of what he understood as the Jewish Renaissance, that is, the battle against mindless, outdated traditions with the hope of a spiritual rebirth and the cultural renewal of the Jewish people. He enriched the movement not only with poems and stories, but also with translations out of Hebrew and Yiddish. He created both original art and a repository of works for the cause of Zionism. This practical attitude to the centrality of culture and art for the creation of a national community naturally translated into his political presence during the Zionist congresses he attended. In the Third Congress in 1899, for example, Buber explained how Zionism to him was not simply a party matter, it was closer to what one would understand as a Weltanschauung. And I quote, "We must win the whole people for our cause. They must not be Zionists as one is conservative or a liberal, but as one is a man or an artist. Zionism as a way of life and an artistic practice. In even more long-term, practical, creative terms, in 1901, Buber served as editor-in-chief of Die Welt, the weekly publication of the World Zionist Organization. He founded a section for Jewish art and knowledge in the Berlin Zionist Union, and in the same year he played the central role in the successful fight that the Democratic Fraction waged against Theodor Herzl for the recognition of the importance of cultural Zionism, and with creativity at the forefront of his argument. In fiery speeches before the plenary session, he spoke of the need to propagandize heavily within the Jewish community and the importance of producing cultural outputs, such as songbooks, literature, and libraries for the youth for the advancement of the Zionist cause. From this position in the Democratic Fraction, Buber and his comrades had significant institutional impact as well. In 1901, their pressure secured the Congress's approval for a national library, and what later became the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Their proposition for subsidizing the Jüdischer Verlag was voted down, but the Verlag was nevertheless founded the next year under the editorship of Buber and Bertolt Feivel. This press produced a Jewish almanac, books on Jewish art, and collections of Jewish poetry, all of which Buber contributed to as well as helped to edit. Shortly after, in 1903, Buber and Chaim Weizmann also announced their first attempt at publishing their Jude, a project which would not flourish until more than a decade later, and which unfortunately I do not have the time to discuss here. In the words of the creatively industrious Buber, we do not want cultural demonstrations, but actual work. Work for the rebirth of a Jewish people, the finest expression of which is the development of a new Jewish folk culture. To what extent Buber's own contribution would today qualify as authentic folk culture is again up for discussion and debate. If anything else, the early 20th century Zionist cultural program and artistic output appear consistent with the wider European development of national schools of art all around the continent. Indeed, I am tempted to make a direct comparison with the Greek National School of Art that during the exact same period challenged the westernizing European influences in Greek art in order to reclaim the Eastern heritage of the Greeks and discovered part of the lost authentic Greek soul in art inspired by folk, Byzantine Orthodox Christian art. So they turned to Byzantium as a way of reclaiming Eastern music, Eastern iconography, Byzantine heritage, as in churches, and Buber's rediscovery of Hasidism happened at exactly the same time, and after he withdrew from the Zionist movement in 1905, when he devoted himself to study and writing as an independent scholar and author. He wrote and edited for the eminent publishing house Ruten und Learning, and he edited Die Gesellschaft, a series of monographs on the social psychology of life in the city. Between 1906 and 1914, he published editions of Hasidic, mystical, and mythic texts from Jewish and world sources, polishing them up through his artistry and craftsmanship. In his own words, Buber did not approach the translation of the allegorical stories of Rabbi Nachman as a translator, but rather he partly reinterpreted and adjusted them to the taste of his time. And I quote, "I had to tell the stories that I had taken into myself from out of myself, as a true painter takes into himself the lines of the models and achieves the genuine image out of the memory formed of them." And so, for this section, the answer to our treasured art for whose sake can be but singular. Art for the sake of the nation as Martin Buber understood it, experienced and envisioned it, absorbed and expressed it anew. Contrary to Herzl, who advocated a humanist nationalism wishing to emancipate a group of citizens that responded to the name Jew and had suffered for it, Buber's turn-of-the-century art envisioned a more exclusionary form of cultural nationalism that aspired to grow a specific variety of Jewish citizen. Consistently with similar nationalist artists of his period, Buber created work explicitly for what he understood as the future purity of the cultural heritage of his people, and that he did boldly, as he himself admitted 50 years later, and I quote again, "I did not yet know how to hold in check my inner inclination to transform the narrative material poetically. I did not, to be sure, bring in any alien motives. Still, I did not listen attentively enough to the crude and ungainly living folk tune which could be heard from this material. The need, in the face of misunderstanding, to point out the purity and loftiness of Hasidism led me to pay all too little attention to its popular vitality." What is interesting to highlight here is that, again, Buber is talking about the evolution of his creative practice. Yes, he had perhaps been an enthused young man enchanted by the zeitgeist, but retrospectively, it was his craftsmanship and his positionality that he reflected upon. In his zest to translate this piece towards the rehabilitation of the Eastern Jewry and the cultural emancipation of his people, he reduced the immediacy of the original text, he highlighted those aspects that proved its cultural purity, and he elevated his own Western and modern voice to the same importance as the original. His methodological remorse does not appear to reflect critically upon the impact of nationalist intentions behind artistic creation, but to rather accept that creators may sometimes outgrow their works. He also gradually outgrew his earliest fear that teaching at the university necessarily meant abandoning the making of living things, and transformed his sociological, political, and artistic experience into a series of elaborate theories on creativity, culture, civilization, and art history. In 1923, he became a lecturer in the study of Jewish religion and ethics at the University of Frankfurt, and in 1930, an adjunct professor of general religious studies. From 1938 to his death in 1965, Buber lived in Jerusalem, where he held the post as professor of sociology of culture and was later the first chairman of sociology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He taught sociology of religion and ethics, social philosophy, and the history of sociology. In his sociological work, Buber channeled his intellectual proximity to the European and more specifically German sociologists, and he drew heavily upon his early Gesellschaft series from 1906. The dominant focus of Buber's sociological work was the search for the understanding of the relation between the social and the interhuman contact, intersubjectivity on the one hand, and the process of cultural creativity on the other. He sought to identify the situations where creativity really can occur, and he believed that these situations exist to some extent in all cultures, but that their fullest development occurs only rarely. From the onset, he conceived of culture not as an ideological system, but as a lifestyle, a mode of life existing in the world, a thesis I would be interested to investigate further, especially in conjunction to his own contribution to the ideological system of early 20th century cultural Zionism. His main sociological concern was to identify those situations in which cultural creativity can be nurtured and promoted. In other words, he searched for the conditions of cultural creativity and of social authenticity which may possibly lead to great social transformations. The central characteristic of such situations, conducive to creativity, is the existence of dialogue, and the strong commitment of participants both to direct interpersonal relations, cutting across more institutionalized and formalized frameworks, and to the sphere of ultimate values. And this is why I chose to open today's presentation with Buber the creative, Buber the self-critic in a sense, preceding Buber the propagandist and Buber the university lecturer. Instructive as his relationship to propaganda can become for practices to avoid and practices to emulate, lessons from this period of his creative life we already more or less know. Institutions are important, and only by taking hold of them can we hope for our visions of culture or art or creativity to materialize in society. But in Daniel, this outcome of what I see as Buber's creative self, the concentrated realist who proposed that the creative man needs neither nationalism nor an external cause to liberate himself and humanity, we can potentially find the methodology of what to apply in our institutions once we reclaim them. Was his opposition to Weltanschauung in Daniel a self-reflective recantation of his earlier uncritical involvement in cultural politics? Was it part of his maturation and evolution into a cultural theorist and an important sociologist of cultural creativity? Is a university lecturer necessarily the opposite to an artist? And are indeed institutions naturally hostile to free creativity? These are all very interesting questions that suddenly appear urgent, especially in the current environment of market-driven creativity and corporate art aesthetics. If we can salvage and reuse different aspects from Martin Buber's relationship to art and creativity, then we need to learn the most valuable lesson from each stage of his life. The young Buber, who only wanted to make living things and found meaning in the dominant ideology of his time. The still young Buber, who withdrew from politics and found new meaning in the liberating power of uninhibited creativity. And the somewhat older Buber, who reflected upon his creative practice and created a theory inspired by the importance of nurturing creativity and applying it in our everyday interpersonal experience as a means of belonging meaningfully in our society. As for Buber himself, shortly after the experience of Daniel, he became significantly more confident and assertive in his right to self-expression. Responding to a complaint about his writing style in Der Jude in 1918, he retorted, I cannot simplify and complicate my diction as I choose. Rather, it comes about necessarily from my mental constitution and my relationship to the subject, and I cannot change it. You can be rid of my style only by getting rid of me. It is inseparable from me and independent of my will. And he lived happily ever after. Thank you very much. And I will take off this terrible idea that I realized because it's very hot, apparently. Oh, Jesus.
Thank you very much.
Artemis.
Thank you very much, Artemis. Yeah, so yeah, I remember your name now. Thank you very much for this very thought-provoking paper about Buber's development and about the place of making living things and creativity in his thinking and how it relates to dialogue. So let's first have a discussion about your paper, and then we go to Michael's paper. So who would like to start? I'll keep an eye on the chat. Oh yeah, can you end the screen share, Artemis? Screen share, sorry. So we can see each other. Yeah. Excellent.
Perhaps I could ask the question. Artemis, I remember as a kid growing up getting a magazine. My parents got a magazine called Jewish Affairs, and it claimed to cover the arts as everything. It was an omnibus type of magazine, and there was precious little visual art in there. And I'm wondering whether for Buber, like what Buber's inclinations were with respect to painting, architecture, sculpture, graphics, photography, cinema, all the non-verbal arts.
This is a great question, and I know he was acquainted. I mean, I know that in literature he was acquainted with the modernists, but I think that when I work on turning this presentation into something more substantial, this is one of the aspects I want to investigate in depth, and not only about the visual arts, but also about music. And make this juxtaposition between the heritage of monophonic Jewish music and the more modern Jewish use of the organ in the liturgy, and see where and what Buber's taste on music and in the pictorial arts was. I can't answer it at the moment, firstly because I couldn't find a copy of Der Jude. So my initial reaction was to look for what he approved or disapproved aesthetically. in public, but I can't find.
And do we know anything about his habits, like going to museums or being a connoisseur of art in any way?
There is this, as I was telling Johan, there is this very promising scholar, Paul Mendes-Flohr. I don't know if
yeah, I know him, a young man.
Once or twice.
He has a lot of promise, I believe.
I think we should give them a chance.
Yeah, we should give him a chance for sure.
We should. But apparently, he was a big fan of the theater, and he received a substantial part of his education in the arts through going to the Burgtheater in Vienna, which at the time was at the forefront of cultural European cultural life. So, this is something I want to look in depth, to be honest. I need to understand his taste, his personal taste.
like a dance would be very interesting. What he thought of dance.
Yeah, but unfortunately, these aspects are not usually covered, and I will need to dirty my hands and look at theater programs and speculate a lot.
Yeah.
I wanted to say just how lovely your presentation was, I think.
Did you like it?
It was really, really lovely. And
it was fun.
It was fun and it was joyful and it really worked. And it made me think about a number of different questions. One was what you were raising about sound. I'm sorry, the telephone has gone off here. But the way that knowing your sound, or what it means to know your own sound, the kind of way that you can, through sound, develop a relationship with self that is there in Daniel and there that you, and so that something about the exploration of sound and the recognition, what it means to think that each person in some way has their own sound, and that through that Buber's thinking about questions of authenticity and our relationship to ourselves, which is challenging, particularly with an intellectual culture that is so text-based. So we tend to think of text, and we tend to think, because we think of text, we tend to think of ourselves in externalized ways. And Buber seems to be bringing us into a very different relationship with self through the medium of sound. I thought that was really kind of striking, and your suggestion that something had happened through the writing of Daniel that allowed him to, and also through his relationship with Landau, to then be more confident, and that in that confidence it allowed him to kind of move forward into his political work in Zionism.
No, yes, I don't know. I find Daniel remarkable as a book for all the propositions it makes about how creativity is a process that if we trust, and of course he says later in the dialogues that it might fail. There is no promise that it will deliver you to a better version of yourself or to a better version of society. It just says, take a leap in the dark and maybe you will like this version of yourself. Maybe it will be what liberates you. And that's why I immediately saw it as a text that he was sort of either writing to himself, or it was the truest, one of those works that were closer to heart to him personally. I think it's a transitory work. I will need to see it in the lineage of his works, but. As for text, I don't know, after the 20th century, with all the movements like Dada and, Bauhaus, text is, and technology these days, text can be anything these days.
It's, I think it's, when I read Daniel's preparation, I was struck by the fact that dialogue on theater is the longest one in the book. Mm. And there's a really elaborate theory or discussion there of what it means for an actor to assume a role, which is, it's like Stanislavski on speed. It's really about authentic. It's not about the hypocritical. It's not putting on a mask. I think it tries to argue very much with that tradition of thinking about theatre, and I thought it was very, very exciting.
Yeah, the only reason I didn't include it in this section was that I want to, apart from the abstract considerations of art as dialogue, I want to create another section that is about theory. So the one on the stage, where is it? The space problem of the stage, which was written in 1913 as well.
Yeah.
That dialogue and drama and theater that he wrote later, I would put them in a section about art theory and see how it connects with 20th century art, and of course with the very conservative output that he himself. This is a very interesting contradiction. How can if there is a contradiction, how can a person be so modernist in a sense, but when it comes to their own culture, his species of modernism I want to examine separately.
Okay, we will maybe get back to that in a minute. I want to go through some questions in the chat. So Emily asks, how can creativity be compatible with propaganda?
Isn't that wonderful? Of course, I mean, there's better propaganda and worse propaganda, and we all experience that in our everyday life. And this is why in the beginning of the paper I said, nationalism and propaganda for me are inhibitions to free creativity and art, but obviously not for everyone. There's beautiful Soviet art. Life, paradigm shifting. They can coexist, and this is why I want to examine the person and not the output. I want to triangulate between the person and the outputs to understand how a person who ended up writing about dialogue and listening, and how as a young man he was a nationalist artist.
No, thank you. Yeah, so Battleship Potemkin is also a work of propaganda and a work of art at the same time.
Shostakovich wrote a lot of propaganda. Yeah.
Anastasia asks, I wonder if you have any reflections on the link of philosophy of art and aesthetics to embodiment, but in particular bodies that might otherwise be excluded.
I need to read that.
Yeah.
The link of philosophy of art and aesthetics. Philosophy of art and aesthetics.
I'm happy to unpack.
Yeah, please, Anastasia, you're here. You can talk, right? Yeah.
First of all, I just wanted to go to my earlier comment in the chat that says, Artemis, this has been such an amazingly captivating performative session with 4 exclamation marks. So fantastic. Thank you very much for that. I immensely enjoyed it. It was excellent. My question has to do with your own personal reflections. If I'm not misunderstanding your expertise, I think you bridge arts with philosophy, and wanted to ask your reflections on this area of analyzing the world. If you think, for instance, philosophy of art and aesthetics is a useful domain to understand embodiment, but the complicated issues surrounding embodiment, for instance, bodies that are excluded primarily because of various stigmatizations in society. And here I'm thinking disabled bodies, or Black bodies, or diseased bodies, or bodies that are other, that are stigmatized, that are excluded. Does a philosophy of art and aesthetics take into consideration those stigmatizations and exclusions and understanding embodiment through art, aesthetics, and philosophy?
To be honest, in my experience from music philosophy that I mainly read, I wouldn't call myself, it's not my area of expertise. I'm a historian. I'm just interested in philosophy as well. one of my main problems every time, and I think that connects to your question, but in a different way, is how I always try to understand when a philosopher writes the word music, what sort of music they understand. And I'm inclined to believe that most of the times when people write the word music, they mean classical music, which is a very specific aesthetic. Up until very recently, for the past 40 or 50 years, maybe since the mid 20th century, we have classical music that is challenging to the ideal of the beautiful, the whole, the masculine in a sense. And again, even in Buber's, that's why I was thinking about what does he mean when he say music, and what does he mean when he says song, because people usually say traditional music when they don't want to say classical music. And song is very specific because within the Jewish culture, song is, as with all Orthodox, more traditional religions, it signifies something very specific. So, to be honest, I think that this is a deconstruction that we need to do now, with the knowledge of the 20th century music that itself deconstructed 19th century ideals and music. So, for example, Schnittke or Ligeti. These musics that take the previous canon and break it apart and put it back together, and then they give us the opportunity to speak about all these things that previous philosophers and historians didn't speak about. The only place I know where there is space for disability and the rest is in community music, for example. And this is their main preoccupation. These excluded bodies outside the canon, and these excluded people, but not in philosophy. From Adorno, I mean, he's written a lot. He must have written something about. He's written about chicken. He must have written something about excluded people, right?
Okay, let's move on because we've got a few other questions. So Jordan asks about. Jordan, maybe you can ask the question yourself. I don't know what BW stands for.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, Johan. So I just found very great presentation, by the way. It was really, as was just said, performative, but in a very positive and personal way, which I really enjoyed. So in the chat, I was really interested in, there was a connection being made between basically the process of creativity and sort of, there was that theme of confidence. And I'm also curious to bring into the discussion, I don't know if it's the opposite of confidence, so to speak, but another element to that process of creativity, of humility. And I'm curious if that relates in any way to what was being said about the connection with confidence and creativity, as I think manifested through the artistic maturation of Buber's younger and older selves.
I mean, I think one of the advantages of very old age, like life itself, is the fact that you can look back and rewrite yourself. And I think that when Buber looked back at his younger self and rewrote himself, he did it with great amounts of humility and understanding that, as I said, he just outgrew himself, his artworks, his ideas, and he looked back and he gave us, different readings of what he understood at the time. To be honest, I never, in all my readings, I never thought that it was missing. Even in the more bold ones, I always respected his demeanor as a writer. And also I don't think I've encountered in this context, I'm sure that in his religious text he must have, but in the texts I read, I don't remember anything about humility. No, sorry.
Would you say that so the story that you told is one where, looking back, we can looking back, it becomes clear to Buber himself what these earlier phases were all about, really. That this is a story of unfolding to a point of maturity, or is it more haphazard than that?
No, I think he had the wisdom to look back with kindness upon himself and understand that some ideas work and some others don't. And he was lucky in that respect. Of course, as a historian looking from the outside, one needs to look critically to all these different approaches to what art and creativity is, and maybe bring them one against the other to understand how this man evolved. But you
said some really interesting things about how, when he was doing the translations, if that's the right word, of the Hasidic texts, he recognized the process that he was involved in. And it was quite a complicated process. It wasn't just a translation. It was a kind of creative reading in terms of what allowed bringing forward something that was significant in the text that might not have been recognized by people at the time almost. So it's really interesting what that kind of creative reading means. And then I wonder, in terms of the contrast between Sholem and Buber, were in terms of how to read those Hasidic texts, or what it means to read, really. What are we doing when we're reading? What are the risks that we're taking in the way that we understand texts? And that, as a creative process, does seem something that Buber is kind of reflecting on even later. And also the way that he was helped in the reworking of those texts. It was a kind of joint project, or at least some of it was a joint project with his partner.
Thanks, Rick.
Yeah, this is way out of my area of expertise, but translation is certainly one of the higher arts in the literary profession, and it does reveal comparative understandings of how something was modernized. I hope to find analysis, to be honest, because obviously I can't read everything for a start.
Yeah. Oh no, I thought you did fabulous. You just really raised all these questions.
I was thinking about the same things, because it is common practice at the time to take an older text and modernize it in order to make it relevant, obviously, to your own people. And
and you bring it to life in a particular way. You know, when you talked about, making a life object or a creative object, you could see the translations and the Hasidic translations as producing life objects of a certain, it's a kind of creative life activity.
Yeah, but then we have the question of time. When practices change over time. So I'm not, again, an expert, but I think in contemporary translation, we would be more aware of our position as translators. And we would try to modernize, but not impose our voice in order to... So the work wouldn't have a life of its own, as in a living thing. It would have borrowed time until the next methodological turn. I think that's how I would distinguish between a living artwork and an artwork that will sort of wither away with time.
But that's so interesting about making of living thing, isn't it? That he was making it and recreating it for a particular movement at a particular time.
Yeah, that I would put...
And we might make it in a very different way now, because translation practice is very different, but also there's something about a humanistic, or translation as a humanistic practice, that Buber seems to be tied into. The idea that the translation will be available to people also from very different cultural backgrounds to learn from this tradition. It's not just specific to the tradition. It's understandable because it's seen as a humanistic practice. And that might be the strength of a certain notion of a humanistic practice that Buber has, and might be part of our interest in him today, because we've lost that in a kind of prevailing anti-humanism. We don't know. We know how to read specific cult literatures in their historical context, but we're very wary about how to read across different cultural frameworks or historical moments.
Yes, thank you. No, I would, yeah, I will think about translation a bit more, because I very hastily, I guess, grouped it with propaganda. But yes, of course, aspects of, well, I will have to rethink. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to do Swati, and then Katrina, and then Federico, and then we're going to Michael's presentation. Thanks very much, Artemis. So Swati remarks, philosophy is finding answers, and propaganda is back to propaganda theme, is telling stories for showing dominance and for self-promotion. Is there any relation between the two? He asked rhetorically. But I was wondering, maybe there is a connection to be made here. You talked about Nietzsche in the beginning and Zarathustra, and Nietzsche's idea of philosophy as a creation of what he calls values, so creation of life or life forms, so the way it is making living things. And Nietzsche, of course, emphasizing the fact that all language is at heart rhetorical, and that this distinction between philosophy and rhetoric is drawn to the detriment of both, and certainly of life itself. Do you think there's a link there, between the relation between propaganda and philosophy or thought, as you portrayed it, and Nietzsche in Buber's thinking?
Yes, I will say yes, because I can't follow up on that.
Okay.
And also I will need a reference for that, because it will come very handy.
Yeah,
But yes to everything.
Yeah. Oh, okay, good. Well, then we go with...
Thank you for the link. Philosophy is my weaker discipline.
I think it's high time for a Nietzsche renaissance, and the postmodernists really made mincemeat out of him in a very bad way, and then before that, fascists. But there is a Nietzsche that has been misunderstood. Okay, anyway, Katrina says, I wonder about. Oh, maybe Katrina, you can ask the question yourself, and then we have Peter and Federico, and then we go to Michael's talk.
Thanks. Yeah, my internet connection is very unstable, so if it goes, just read it from the chat. It was just a footnote to the exchange, which I really enjoyed, between Anastasia and Artemis on this question of embodiment and exclusionary forces within, say, Western art music or classical music, whatever we want to call it. And because you mentioned Adorno then, Artemis, in your reply, I just wanted to come back to that, because I think, yes, on the one hand, of course, the institutions could be exclusionary. So we all know that access to Western art music, classical music, is exclusionary, but is not inherent to the art form itself. And I think not. I think that's very strongly the point made by Adorno and others, that, and Bloch as well, that the utopian kernel of this tradition is its inherent democratizability, and that everybody can, I mentioned there Beethoven's deafness, but that was perhaps a little glib, but I think there are plenty of examples. I think I've frozen again.
Yeah, the only problem with music is that it's abstraction, so it always needs to be mediated. So yes, of course, inherently music, but unless someone curates and presents it, so yeah, I understand that it's not inherent in the music, but unless we educate people up to the standard that they understand the music themselves, the mediation is as good as the intention, unfortunately, to me.
Katrina has now transitions. Did you get that, Katrina? Okay, we leave it at that, and we go to Peter's question about hermeneutics, then Federico, and then we go to Michael.
Hermeneutics.
Peter.
Johan,
yeah.
Do you have any idea about Buber's relationship to hermeneutics?
particular development of distinct spiritual elements, I think is a very big topic, maybe for some other time.
Yes, I would love to. I have a very big reply on that, but unfortunately,
Okay.
Unfortunately, we don't have the time because Michael is very patient.
Yeah, maybe we should pick this up at towards the end if there's time left. But it would be very interesting to hear that. I'm not a friend of hermeneutics, as you may know. Federico, quickly your question, if you can do it quickly, and then we go to Michael.
Yes. So my point was about creativity and understanding it in a very schematic way between an active side and a passive side, because I remember this quote that I just reread here from Ian Thao, in which Buber says, to produce is to draw forth, to invent is to find, to shape is to discover. So there is this idea that in this I-Thou relationship with the artist faces something which calls himself to the act of creation, and this pre-exists the creation, and it is by responding to it that this creation happens. And I wonder how this, I'd call it schematically a passive side, or the artist as a receiver or as a means or a medium through which the art streams forth. How can you combine it with the what you stressed in your presentation about the craftsmanship, about the positionality upon which Buber reflects in his late life when he rethinks what he did in his youth? So in this case, stressing the very active side, if I may say so, the ability to impress a form. So whether you have some thoughts about this and how to combine them.
Before I redirect you to Michael, who's sitting on the left and down from me, so I'm pointing at him. The thing about passivity is what I read in one of the articles about Buber's aesthetics, and this is as far as I have gone with the theoretical part of his art, is that what I read is that he understands art as pre-existing in the world, and you don't find it, you extract it. So I can't. I'm sorry. I haven't read enough of his more theoretical things to be able to relate to that question. But I think that the theory is that art exists, and you relate to the reality through essentially cutting it out of reality and making it into a thing.
I think he followed Schopenhauer.
There, you see, Michael. I told you he would.
No. Because Schopenhauer's world is will and representation. I mean, he posits a world where reality itself wants something. We can represent. So it kind of comes through you. It's a very mystical idea. I'll mention Louis Kahn as an architect who tapped into that every building already wants to be. It wants to exist, and that an architect is simply a midwife in the sense that brings the building that wants to be into being. But these things are constructed at the world of existence will. I'm not a great Schopenhauer scholar. I've read about him, and I sense that that's where maybe Buber gets some of it from. I know it was very, very big in the German Romantic notion of existence having will.
Precisely, and they linked it also always to Renaissance art, to Michelangelo talking about the shape that's already in the stone, and Platonic notions of artistic creation, which seems to be the only way that you can guarantee a dialogical relation to the work of art.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether this conception of art is at odds with what he did in what you labeled as propaganda. So, or for example, if I have to combine them, I have both in front of me as an artist the piece of art that calls me to be realized, and as a political subject, I have a mission to accomplish, and that I combine them by receiving both them and combining them. Or if we conceive it art in this form of creativity at odds with propaganda. Propaganda is the impression of something, and art is the receiving of something. So I wonder whether when you talk about nationalism and this crafting of a new national identity and so on in Buber, you had the impression that Buber was crafting something out of basically an idea, or whether he had a similar approach and towards art and towards this the Jewish Renaissance that he was trying to be trying to help.
Honestly, I would think about it the other way around, especially as a historian, when something, because of time, linear time, I can understand how, looking back, he could draw on his practices and evolve in his practice and write his theory on art, thinking about the different stages and relationships he had with art. But I'm not convinced that at the time he had formed this whole idea and he was acting on it. There is no, I can't find any evidence, exactly because the vocabulary he uses is very consistent with many other national movements that are looking for the authentic folk, mainly because of modernism. And again, I think that, as I said later, he read back his life and he created new knowledge out of how he understood life in his different, how he understood art in its different forms.
Right. Thank you very much. We're going to leave it at that for now. Maybe we can get back to it at the end. So thank you once again for this wonderful talk. And it segues nicely into Michael's talk now. So we'll go to, thanks Artemis, we're going to Michael Benedict, who has been with us also for the duration of the seminar mostly. Michael acts as Distinguished Professor of Architecture at the University of Texas in Austin, where he also holds the Halbox Chair in Urbanism. And you may already have read his chapter from Architecture Beyond Experience, which we put in the folder quite a while ago. And I believe that's also the basis for the talk today. Michael, I'm very, very grateful that you have found time to speak to us about Buber's relation or Buberian ideas in architecture and what that can tell us about art and aesthetics.
I'll try. I'm wondering, Johan, would this be a good time for a 5-minute break?
If people
would like to sort of get up and go somewhere down the hall.
Would you like that? Okay, yeah.
I'm happy.
I'm happy. I'm happy to go on a little bit beyond 6 if people can do that. So that's fine. It's always difficult to manage time, but so yeah, absolutely. And if you would
like a short break would be a good idea.
Then we take a 5-minute break. Let's be back here in 5 minutes.
Thank you, guys.
Okay. Thank you.
Go and get some coffee.
Yeah.
Modern language research.
By the way, Artemis, your Kinderfest is, I thought it was wonderful in this context because it made me think of Zizek's interpretation of the surprise egg, the Kinder surprise egg.
Oh, of course.
Where he talks about the Platonic agalma, it's the outside, you look for the surprise inside, but you realize it's not really worth the trouble. And then you realize that the unwrapping was the thing, the surface is the thing.
The unwrapping.
The substance, yeah. Okay.
We should all have such jackets.
We should all have such jackets. Yeah, no, I think it's true.
And we kind of shake around and make the noises appropriate.
Precisely. Okay, so Michael, I think most people are probably on their way back. Let's see how far we are. Yeah. Maybe not quite everyone. But we're 5 minutes in, so I would say the floor is yours.
Yeah, I'm trying to, I'm having a little technical difficulty here. Can you guys see my back screen called on Buber Art and Architecture or not?
Now we see a black screen. At least I see a black screen, but I saw the title earlier. It's disappeared now.
Right, so I'm trying to use two monitors and they are not getting along.
Now we can see it. Now we can see...
Okay.
Yeah, this is it. Yeah, on Buber Art and Architecture.
Okay. So I now find I cannot see my own notes. So, all right.
Would it help if I showed the presentation or?
No. Just how can I do this? Well, listen. I'm just going to extemporize just based on this. Is everyone there? Do you think? Okay. Well, let me start by saying I first read Buber when I was a teenager. I am the sort of only child of two Holocaust survivors who pretty much lost their faith because of that event. And there were a lot of books around the house. The Bible is history. They were very much Zionists, both my parents. And Buber was actually the only person my dad read for any kind of religious or spiritual guidance. So I was 16 or 17 when I read I and Thou, totally intrigued by it, didn't understand it. And I have to say I've probably read it 6 or 7 times since, as I've matured, finding more and more in it. And So even though I became an architect, I've long been interested in philosophy and in Buber particularly. But it's taken till, maybe 5 or 10 years ago for me to return to Buber one more time in a different context, which I'm going to try to spend some time with here. The relationship between philosophy and architecture is one that's never really been explained very well. But the fact is that most prominent architects, most of the architects you've heard of, Frank Lloyd Wright, Le Corbusier, and so forth, all came out of certain kinds of philosophical reflections. None were professional philosophers, obviously. Very few of them wrote very systematically in philosophy. But philosophy was always there. And it was there it actually had tremendous influence on the rise of modernism, which expressed itself greatly through architecture. The pragmatism of architecture was very much part of the Bauhaus. And it was part of the rejection, modern philosophy was part of the rejection in architecture too, of all things classical, and representing mostly a Protestant and undecorated functionalism, which became synonymous with philosophy. As soon as that happened, there was a flotilla of young architects who tried to find their way back, in some sense, to a more humanistic rendition of what architecture could be about, who buildings were for, how buildings were made. And among these, in a story still to be written, was the rise of Jewish architects. Because for the longest time, architects were not Jewish. Architects could not be Jewish because architects, to do what they did, had to move among royalty and aristocrats and landowners. And they tended to be gentlemen, not women. They tended to be gentlemen, or rise from the crafts, the craft guilds, or be part of the aristocracy. And these were occupations not open to Jews for the longest time. Come the 20th century, that changes a little bit. And we now have probably the most idolized today architect of the 20th century, Louis Kahn, and people like Frank Gehry, you may have heard of. And it's quite surprising now how many prominent architects are Jewish. It's an open question. I do not have the answer as to how much of their architecture is different, if at all, and to how much that could be explained by anything like Jewish philosophy. But in the case of actually one non-Jewish architect, Aldo van Eyck, who I mentioned before, is a great modernist, had read Buber and did things like spoke about the between. In fact, idolized the idea of the between, thought his whole architecture was about the between and about the making of community. But we also have, since then, Louis Kahn, who is, I'm something of a scholar of the architect Louis Kahn. And you'll see some of his work. And you'll see me try to sort of get into that now. So let me start with my presentation, if that's even possible. Okay, so the book in which I try to bring this together contains that chapter on Buber, which some of you have read. But I thought I would share this from a later chapter because it sort of explains where I'm coming from. This is a sort of a relational picture of the world, which I think different professions, different people would trace out differently. But for me, the relationships fall into three categories of objects: people and animals, that is, things and artifacts, rooms and spaces. Now, I think most of you probably do not think of things and rooms as ontologically different. As an architect, for me, they're distinctly different things, things and rooms. But it's interesting that even with this very, very simple tripartite ontology, we realize that most of what Buber talks about, most of what we all talk about when we are being relational, is the circle on the very top. That is the relationship of people to people, maybe people to animals, very rarely animals to animals. So we're pretty sure that the world is divided like this. My claim in the book and my proposition here is that artists are people that do not recognize this dotted line. That is, they are somewhat animists, if you will. And when Buber spoke about bringing things to life or making living works, there are consequences to that thought. There are consequences to thinking that life extends beyond human beings. And that if all these relationships are possible, then really it's conceivable that there are I, it, and I-you relations between things. So it became intriguing to me, as an architect in particular, to wonder about what would it mean for two rooms to be related in an I-you way versus an I-it way. Understanding all the time that this is a kind of a projection. No one's fool enough to think that a room is a living object or that a chair is a living object. But my claim is that extending oneself in that way is part of the ethical impulse. And to see what I mean by that, I'm going to try to read something. Well, first, I'm operating without notes, guys, so excuse a slightly scattered presentation. This is going to be from my chapter on Buber, discussing the difference between I, it, and I-you. In I, it, this is an excerpt. In I, it, people deal with each other. In I-you, they meet. As scholars of Buber, we understand what that means. But here's my illustration of that. You go to an aquarium. An old turtle glides by, and you hold eye contact for 3 long seconds. You're exhilarated. Later, do you say, and there was this turtle? Or do you say, I met this turtle? At some level, of course, you did simply experience the turtle, in as much as it passed into and out of your vision, leaving a trace in your mind like a small movie reel. You might also have classified it as beautiful or ugly, or beautifully ugly, as foreign and familiar, and so on, grasping for words. But if something else passed between you in that 3 seconds, call it an understanding, an opinion, a recognition, a caring, then something more happened in the world than 2 experiences in 2 brains. What happened was more like a momentary reconfiguration of the world itself. What happened was a single event, an encounter, in which everything physical, from the layout of the aquarium to the rays of light that joined the turtle's fovea to yours, played a role. The hunter of old kneels over the animal he has slain. Forgive me, he whispers. This is I-you. Looking up, the hunter offers a prayer of thanks. This may or may not be I-you. He stands up to think about how to get the carcass home. This is I-it. So my feeling there was that the architect and the artist has a way of looking at the world as one looked at that turtle. or as one looked at that slain animal. The passionate involvement of oneself with the being of the other can extend itself to others that are not humans and not even animals. I was struck every time I read Buber on this at how Buber saw it as a optional, as a unilateral thing, and that the discussion about whether IU had to be reciprocal was clearly not in Buber's thinking. There's nothing reciprocal about IU. It is offered completely unilaterally, whether or not you get a response, whether or not you expect a response. And I think this is the fundamental position of the artist. In my notes, I have... Now, I have some quotes that I'll read maybe a little later. I'm now going to move into some of the illustrated section. Buber did not write about architecture that I could find. But he did have a good friend, an Israeli architect named Leopold Krakauer. And in one of the books of essays, there's a short essay by Buber in honor of Krakauer. But it was interestingly in honor of Krakauer's drawings, because Krakauer was also a painter and a draftsman. So these are some of the paintings by Krakauer. And Buber, rightly I say, sort of rhapsodized about this kind of drawing. It's obviously a rocky hillside somewhere around Jerusalem. The trees, the stone wall, the leaves seem to be blowing in the wind. There's a kind of an energy that is coursing through this picture. If you're an art critic, you could sort of say where that's coming from technically. But certainly there's a vibrancy and a life, a ruach or a nefesh that's really blowing through this picture. Unfortunately, Krakauer's architecture was the exact opposite of that. Krakauer's architecture was truly quite bad, I think. It was Bauhaus inspired, and it would not have inspired Buber to say good things. So I'm going to take you through now a few images from some architects I believe Buber would have liked, and certainly that illustrates some of the deeper points about what an IU relationality would be between things and between rooms, not just between people, nor actually between people and things, but between the things themselves. So this is an old church at Ronchamp, at Notre Dame de Haute. I think this is the ruins of it. And this is what the architect Le Corbusier did. And what on this very same piece of land, and using the rubble from this church. So this is the building, which you may or may not have ever seen, called, it's just known now as Ronchamp. It's a very, very amazing building. It was done late in Le Corbusier's life. Le Corbusier was a rough contemporary, maybe a little younger than Buber. Did he read Buber? Who knows? Did Buber see this? Who knows? So when you read about this, if you went to architecture school, you would very quickly be shown this building.
Excuse me,
yes.
Where is it situated, sir?
This is in France, the very central part of France. Okay?
Okay, got it.
Okay, just look up Ronchamp, Ronchamp. It's often likened to a nun's hat, The nuns of this order wear a kind of a pointed hat. But it's also the underside of a rowing boat, which Le Corbusier was a great swimmer, and he drew rowing boats on the beach. He also he drowned actually. Swimming is how he died. I want you to look though at, there's lots and lots to be said here. I'm going to point out the figure, almost human-like figure at the entrance on the left, with the cowl and the sort of the back of the head on the left. And I'm also going to point out that tilted wall on the left. It's on the east side with its scattered windows inside. So this is the plan of that building. Notice how thick its walls are. They are filled with the rubble of the old church. The entrance is on the left, that swooping entrance. And there's another entrance, or perhaps an exit, in the middle on the top side. And those are small chapels. Those are called small chapels. I want to take you to the interior. So this is what it looks like outside. The thing to notice, I think, is the anthropomorphism of the towers. The Mother Superior to the right, the two junior nuns to the left that stand back to back facing outward, that allow people to come and go between them. The Mother Superior standing at the main entrance. Here we are at the back, and you can see these three figures in relation to each other. So in architecture, the relationships of back to back, face to face, shoulder to shoulder, side to side, like the fact that these figures have a front and a back and a visage is terribly important. But notice how very, very far from literal they are. There are no eyes, there are no noses. With architecture, you have to be very, very careful, because as you get closer and closer to being a cartoon of people, it becomes quite laughable. And so it's a dangerous game. The dangerous game you're playing is, can you create an architecture whose deep abstraction nevertheless appeals to the deepest sociological impulses that you have as a person? And you see this dialogical relationship sort of everywhere. That gigantic roof obviously collects a lot of water when it rains. Here he expresses the spout. That spout, when it rains, obviously, the water cascades down into that cylinder and then into the pool with a small community of basic shapes. And that's where the rainwater goes. And you see that sort of bulge in the wall. So this whole building is sort of informed with a sort of dialogical spirit. You always are going to see two of something, never just one. Everything has a call and everything has a response. If we go inside, this is the interior, and you'll notice that all those little windows on the east wall, they're very small, but each one of them has a stained glass at the back. Stained glass clearly is a reference to churches in general. But here, every one of them is personal. One of them has Le Corbusier's mother's name in it, for example. But also one looks at that randomness, and you realize, at least I realized, that when people fill those pews, they too are going to be in a sort of a random order. And the relation is set up between people in the pews and each window. So we're seeing a kind of a pairing. The windows seem to be collected on the wall the way people would be distributed in the pews. So this is an example of one of the windows. And I don't know about you, but when you go and visit this and you see this tiny work of art, this window is maybe a foot by a foot, maybe a little bigger. The intimacy of it, the way it draws you into itself, the way it colors the light, one almost wants to shrink and get close to it oneself. It's tremendously intimate. There are other morphic relationships or dialogical relationships that architecture, I think, embodies. If you ask yourself, what is the first home of the child? The first home of a baby is obviously the mother's womb, where the preborn baby probably doesn't really know where it is. But for at least a year or two after, the primary home of a child is the mother herself. And I was struck by this particular image, the way the mother's legs, her shopping bag in this case, but anything else. There are two children in this picture, and they are her architecture. Sorry, the mother is the children's home. And in fact, she'll put blankets on them to protect them. That very, very fundamental relationship really is pre-human. The protection of the mother for the young. And sometimes when one sees compositions like this, which is another building by Le Corbusier, it's the Monastery of La Tourette, the chapel at the bottom with the 3 skylights, and the bell tower, clearly. But to understand this functionally is not to understand it at all. To understand why this composition is so affecting is to read, I think, the mother and the child. It's to read the lookout, the one who stretches its neck to see and to announce and to hear, and the slightly unruly children at the bottom, like puppies in a basket, straining to look in different directions, enclosed by a wavy arm or wall. Now, clearly, 99% of the people who go and see this love it, but they don't know why. I think understanding relationality at the sociological, the psychological level begins to help us see how and why this composition works. Another example, I don't know why, I just keep finding bird examples. So look at this. And this is the gravesite of the Brion family, designed by the Italian architect Carlo Scarpa as part of a larger mausoleum. The Brion pater and mater are in these caskets, and you'll notice how they lean towards each other. The bases are curved, which makes it look like they could rock towards each other at any moment and come closer. The yearning that's expressed here is absolutely palpable. And so is the protective wing, or the protective arc or shelter. Architecture, and this architecture is very, very close to pure sculpture, I have to say. But all of architecture is open to these super, super deep readings that I think Buber gives us access to. A group of elephants, clearly. This takes us to the work of Louis Kahn, and one work in particular. Before I say that, let me say that Kahn was known for mystical pronouncements. And one of them was, and you might have heard this, I asked brick what it wanted to be, and it said, does anyone know the answer to that? I asked brick what it wanted to be. Anyone know what his answer was? Okay, his answer was an arch. So I just want you to think, if you're in an architecture environment, you'd answer that question rapidly. First of all, what brick wants to be an arch? First of all, who talks to brick? Only Buber talks to brick, okay? And Louis Kahn talks to brick, and an animist talks to brick. Secondly, why would a brick say, why would not a brick not say, I want to be a pile? It's like, leave me alone, go away, just throw me down over here. But Kahn said, no, brick, I asked brick what it wanted to be, and it said an arch. Now, an arch is actually, no one brick can make an arch. An arch is a communal form. It takes dozens of, perhaps hundreds of bricks to make an arch. And they have to cooperate, and they have to submit themselves to a higher order. And each brick that's part of an arch exists in an elevated way, one might say, and in fact performs something of a miracle. So for Kahn, a brick was already a full participant in the creation of something greater than any one brick, any humble material could be. But Kahn also approached the architectural composition as the simulation, if you will, or the demonstration or the embodiment of a Buberian sort of community. I don't know what Buber thought of elephants, but this is the kind of building that resulted from it. It's the head government building of Dhaka in Bangladesh. It consists, as you can see, of, Kahn had very little access to great craftsmanship because it was actually hand-built in Bangladesh. So it couldn't be full of steel and it couldn't have intricate things. But here we see, surrounding a central government chamber, all the functions of government clustered around like this. And it's interesting if you're an architect, and that's a mosque on the right. Those 4 circles is a mosque. And that mosque is slightly tilted. Notice that's not a mistake. It's slightly tilted so as to face Mecca. And that what you see in the middle is the chamber of conversation. And around it, the various office and functionary institutions. And the space of the between is the ring that goes around. If this were a longer lecture, I could show you dozens of slides of how marvelous that is. Or you guys could watch a movie called My Architect. It's a movie made by his son, Nathaniel Kahn, about his father. And there's a long segment on this building and how very, very, very emotional the people of Bangladesh feel about this building. During a war, when there was bombing everywhere, this building was not touched. This is by the Pakistanis. In the world of art, I thought I would show just two things. These 2 are in my book. This is by Marina Abramovic, or Abramovic, an American artist. And this piece, she's a performance artist, which means her works all involve human interaction. And in fact, the whole world of performance art is simply waiting for a Buberian interpretation. But in this particular one, this is called The Artist is Present. It happened in 2010, I believe, Museum of Modern Art. It went for a month. She took over this space. She's in that red dress in there. And for a month, she sat in that chair without moving for, I think, 9 hours a day, without eating, drinking, or moving. People from the public lined up every day for a month, 8 hours a day. lined up to just sit in front of her. And that's all that happened. There was no conversation, no nothing. There was just this confrontation, if you will, between Marina Abramovic and whoever was there. Now, interesting, sometimes this turned into laughter and sometimes into tears, both of them crying their eyes out for no reason. It was speechless at all times. I sure wish Martin Buber had lived to see this. Talk about turning a social moment into high art. This would have to have been it. I think there's a lot to be asked about the role of the witnesses, those people around who are watching it all the time. How important was that? Why is this not the same as just meeting someone for coffee? Like the whole notion of what makes this great art. If you told your mother, I saw this artist, she sits on a chair and she looks at people, that's the art, you'd just be laughed out of the room. But in fact, this is really, really, I think, extremely great art. And it's very interesting to go back over Marina Abramovic's history from a Buberian perspective or an I-thou perspective. I'm going to show just a few more works by a school of art called Monoha, M-O-N-O-HA. It was a group of, and it still is, the practitioners are very old now, called the School of Things. And in the School of Things mode of art was always dialogical. And I found for an architect very profound because nonverbal. This is nonverbal ways. This is a little bit like the Abramovic piece, is it not? Except it's two stones and the table is turned into sheets of but of course this predates Abramovic's by a lot. I think it's amazing to come across this and to understand that one is outside of it, that you are not the dialogist, the stones are the dialogists, shall we say. And that they become pregnant in a way with presence. This is another example of Monoha art. And you have to ask yourself, what happened here? How, aside from how does this make you feel? Because this does induce certain feelings, I think, in anyone who looks at it. But it also has narrativity in it. Like, it doesn't seem like a huge problem to get this done, but in a kind of a fictional narrative universe, what would cause four gigantic logs to leap onto a column and allow themselves to be bound like this? Is this some kind of sacrifice about to happen? Why is that a rope left hanging so casually, so carefully, and so casually onto the floor? Is there any other kind of support? Is the rope doing all the work? What would it be like what would you feel like if you were one of those logs? Maybe is the column weak? Are these four logs healing the column, which otherwise might break or is bent? Is this like a gigantic bandage? Or is this a hostage crisis of some kind? Now, these kinds of questions obviously don't have right and wrong answers. But this artist, his name is Li Ufan, is speaking to objects here. And by allowing the objects to speak to each other, are allowing us to engage in the observation, anyway, of a dialogue and a dialogue ourselves. And it's distinctly not about us. This is one of my favorites. Here, the plywood table and the rod and the stick and the stones, there are no hidden screws. There's no glue. Those rocks really are preventing that wood from sliding out. And the rock at the back really is preventing that strut from sliding out. The artist actually had trouble getting this shown for a while because it was considered dangerous, that it could actually hurt someone, if something happened, someone touched it. But it did get shown eventually. So for me, through Buberian glasses, you're really seeing something here about encounter. You're seeing something about the dangers, if you will, of encounter, and what it means to put yourself at stake, what it means for a work of art to not just represent something, but to actually be something, to not just represent relationships, but actually exhibit and be in relation in which something is at stake. Here, how many characters are there here? 2, maybe 3, maybe 4 if you count the rocks. But for me, there's no way to look at this without relationality. Okay. So I don't know how I'm doing for time, but
yeah, we're at 6 o'clock, but just finish your talk.
Okay.
If people need to leave, then we understand.
Yeah, I don't mind if people need to leave. Please give me a moment to refine my notes. Okay. So I'm going to read 2 pieces from Buber himself, and maybe I'll just stop there. This is from the chapter called Dialogue in Between Man and Man. And maybe actually, I was going to do slides after this, but maybe it's pretty good that we looked at pictures first. This is Buber. To all unprejudiced reflection, it is clear that all art is from its origin essentially of the nature of dialogue. All music calls to an ear not the musician's own, all sculpture to an eye, not the sculptor's. Architecture, in addition, calls to the step as it walks in the building. They all say something, not a feeling, but a perceived mystery that can be said only in this one language. Here's another from the same essay. Be clear what it means when a worker can experience even his relation to the machine as one of dialogue. When, for instance, a compositor tells that he has understood the machine's humming as, quote, a merry and grateful smile at me for helping it set aside the difficulties and obstructions which disturbed and bruised and pained it, so that now it could run free. Must even you, my dear opponent, think then of the story of Androcles and the lion? But when a man draws a lifeless thing into his passionate longing for dialogue, lending it independence and, as it were, a soul, then there may dawn in him the presentiment of a worldwide dialogue, a dialogue with the world happening that steps up to him even in his environment, which consists partly of things. So I'll leave it there. Some other things I wanted to read, but I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Michael. That was a wonderful presentation and highlighted a lot of the elements that we've been talking about. Yeah, let's have some discussion about it, and then we can close off with a few general remarks. So, who would like to start?
Marcus.
So, please go ahead.
Sorry. Both of those presentations were excellent, and really, I feel, bring to an end this very, very enthralling set of presentations by explaining the relationship between Buber and art in a way which is easy for the non-academics amongst us to understand, for which I'm very grateful. I wonder, Michael, have you written, is this all in the book, or are some of the things you were showing us here not in the book?
This is the book.
In the book, great.
Yeah, this and a lot more is in the book. There was one other quote I was going to read, but it's, I think time is short.
Thank you very much.
Please enjoy the book.
Yeah, do you want to read it out, the quotation you had?
Yeah.
Yeah, it would be good. No.
All right, so this is not Buber, it's yours truly. And it's in a chapter where, because the book is really about, a lot of it's about animism, and one constantly has to remind oneself that animism is a very romantic idea, the idea that everything is alive, or that everything has being. And there are different ways to be rational about what's living and what's not living, and yet extend oneself as though the thing were living. Like, why do that? Okay, because it's rationally not true. So this is one attempt of maybe 20 in the book to sort of recover that feeling while staying rational about it. So I've just gone on and on about buildings being, a building, I say, can be confident or shy, it can be honest or disingenuous, it can be didactic or dialogical, it can be generous or miserly, awkward or elegant. These are all words that we apply to people, but they actually apply to artworks and they apply to buildings, especially from my point of view. Okay, so this is the quote. All this is projection, of course. Einfühlung. Buildings don't really do or feel any of these things. Then again, the other metaphors, I discuss other metaphors in architecture, are projections too. Buildings are not obviously and certainly not literally languages or machines or organisms or landscapes. So those are the other metaphors. But here is the difference. Thinking of buildings as beings is fundamentally ethical. Thinking of buildings as beings is fundamentally ethical. Because an essential credit-giving, anti-reductive principle governs the ethical life. And that principle, stated poetically, is this: to treat stones like plants, to treat plants like animals, to treat animals like humans, and younger humans like older, wiser ones. It is to treat strangers like friends, and friends like family, to treat family like your own self, and your own self as an agent of the divine, a spark, a hand, helping to preserve, honor, and promote all forms and instances of life, especially those that can do the same. Apply this principle, this default conferral upon all things and creatures of a more evolved intelligence, of a better nature or higher being than one has strict evidence for them having, and one is likely to behave admirably. Let the burden of proof, one is saying, fall upon those who would pronounce others dumb or lacking. So I see here an ethical principle crossing over into what we call purely the aesthetic.
So if you regard it as an ethical principle, why would you regard it as a principle and why would you regard it as a projection amongst other possibilities, given that what you shared so beautifully, and it just made me want to sit in your class for the next 6 months and watch those wonderful buildings and your explanations of them.
Yeah.
But I didn't know why it's beyond experience. When you say architecture,
that's
beyond, because I thought what you're helping me to do is to form my experience of these different places. And when you put the image of the elephants together as a family in front of the Dakar building, and then showed us the moment later, I thought that was just wonderful. It just made sense.
Yeah.
It wasn't a projection. It made, because of your understanding of Khan's work, you opened it up to a way of understanding it, which, as you said, if you just understand it in terms of efficiency or projection or something, or it just doesn't work. You've made the building live through the way you thought about it.
Yeah, I think you caught the argument is in full flight rhetorically. So when I said all these are projections, this is just projection, I was actually in a certain way talking to the opponent.
Yeah.
I was saying, you could dismiss this as projection, but I'm telling you it's not. It's not just projection. It is actually a life principle.
But you've even done more. You've done more than that, because you said people know when they're in this building, say the Corbusier, they feel something,
yes,
but can't really make sense of it. And then you've given them away.
I've given them a way to make sense of it.
Well, just
but
to
I hopefully given future architects the way to think about it.
Yeah.
I mean, my career is to teach young architects to be good architects. And so it's a little like teaching in a cooking school. I'm teaching chefs. I'm not teaching diners. They have to actually produce, right? And so the existential situation they are in, which is that of not knowing what to do, is my daily. It's like difference between teaching literature and teaching creative writing. It's like, you've got to read, but ultimately you have to write. So my students have to make something, and so I have to do my best to convey to them the reasons for doing so and the thoughts to have while doing so. And Buber is a mine of those kinds of things. I think Artemis's beautiful presentation of creativity was really, that's where you're at. As for the question of experience, the book's called Architecture Beyond Experience, which is pure Buber, by the way, because experience is I, it. Relation is I, thou. And I'm saying you actually can't access these feelings and these metaphors without first establishing a thou or a you relationship with inanimate objects. You really have to care for the inanimate object. And I think we all have experience of that. There are objects that you treasure, that you keep in special drawers and boxes in velvet, and that you would be very upset if they were stolen or broken. There are artworks that get better treatment than people. I think this is not strange. I really do think that objects have being in them in some way, and that being is not just the trace of its maker. Right?
No, I completely. No, when the turtle.
Yeah.
And I'm relating to the turtle, which I think you did so beautifully. And I'm in relationship with that turtle, but also in the space that I'm in. So the objects are part of my relationship with that turtle. That is my experience. And so a question would be, is Buber right to think that, or are there difficulties in the interpretation of Buber if we think experience is an I it?
I'm going to I'm going to park the question now because
John,
Sergio, you were next up. First is Katrina and then Sergio. And we can come back to the.
Yes, sir.
We talked about it several times already. Yeah.
Oh, it was sorry to drag things out. I just really, really enjoyed that presentation so much, Michael.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to come back to your tripartite diagram of relationality at the beginning, and to try and ground it ecologically also somehow, so that if you have the people and animals, the rooms, the spaces, the things, the artifacts, where in that set of relationships do you locate metabolic transformations between matter and energy? Where do you locate the vegetal, which also includes fossil fuels, which themselves are vegetal in origin? Where do you locate the mineral? And might that lead then to a slightly different and perhaps less affirmatively Buberian reading of concrete gigantism as we've seen it in architectural modernism, which I love, and I'm totally won over by the maternal connotations that you showed us so clearly, and by those lines and the intimacy of those buildings. So they're not just these behemoths, but in terms of an energetic regime, we begin to realize their ecological implications, and how would that then complicate the triad that you showed us at the beginning?
Yeah, well, Katrina, when I devised that, I realized that if a tripartite gives me 6 relationships, I, it, and I, thou makes 12, and I just thought it was going to get out of hand. I had earlier versions which had 4, and the vegetal or the biological was definitely one of the categories, because it's clearly a problem. What is a plant? A plant is not an animal, and a plant is not a thing. So it exists somewhere in the zone between. But I just felt in terms of the economy of theorization that I couldn't give it a place, because then someone would make an argument that there need to be 5 poles in it, 6 poles in it, and so forth. But you're absolutely right. There should be a room for the vegetal. But how long would it take before someone said, well, what's the difference between a mushroom and a palm tree, or
Well, and I think that, the significance of the mushroom in contemporary ecological theorizing is no surprise if we think of someone like Anna, that it's what feeds on the rotting. I suppose it was just a way to try and metabolize those relationships in a more materialist fashion than I know Buber would necessarily perhaps.
No, I think I would hope that people interested in that would expand that. For me, as my phenomenology and my ontology is very interested in the difference between at what a room is. Like for me, a room is a magical moment when something becomes not a thing but a room, and how we feel about rooms and so forth. So, yeah, I was targeting where I wanted to go. But you're right. There should be a pole for vegetal.
Thank you very
between
much.
Animals and things. Yeah.
Thanks, Katrina. Sergio, did you have a question or not? I wasn't quite clear.
No, what she wanted to say, I just wanted to have the very same kind of question. So more or less, I have got the idea. So it's all right. And as a matter of fact, what John Cybers, who is from London, you are, sir, holding a fountain pen. So I find it as a kind of aesthetic to an extent. So it is a fountain pen. So I feel it is some kind of, excellence. Classic. So that's what, sir. Can you show for once? Just it's an earnest request in front of you.
Yeah. All right.
Yes. Even I'm also using the very fountain pen. Okay, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So, Vic and Michael, can you respond to this question about experience? So, so are we not missing something when we
I think
just take
over.
over?
If I look at it through Buber, here's what it reminds me of, Vic. It reminds me of that long argument about whether there is such a thing as altruism. Because if you say that when you act altruistically, you feel good, or it makes you feel good to be altruistic, then then you're not being altruistic, because altruism because you can always say, well, it's about your self-interest and about your pleasure and so forth. So there's no such thing as altruism. So something similar happens with the word experience. There are a lot of people who just instinctively feel like experience has to be the bottom line. Like me and my experience is what has to be explained. Like this is the alpha and omega of philosophical discussion, is like experience. And I think we hear Buber questioning that when he says experiences from the world of I-it. Like if you are having experiences, then you are thinking about who you're going to tell. You're thinking about how I'm going to remember this. You're thinking about what value does it have. You're beginning to commodify your experience. But I think what he wants to say is that in relation, that in some sense relation in a way precedes experience. Like you first actually have to care. Even to notice, you have motivation. This is a Husserlian point, right? You have to care, you have to intend, and you have to actually be in a relation to something that you can later say was an experience. But I think the idea of relation is in a certain way more primitive.
So that's a very important addition to sort of the Buber image that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
We tend to think I-it comes first, and then you add something, and then it's I-you, but it's
right.
the way around. Yeah.
Right, and I think if you look at animal studies of how animals move in the world, they move in the world in a very distinct, who are you, what are you a danger, will you eat me, can I eat you, where did you go, what are you thinking about? That's the first way of looking. The second way of looking is, I like the color, I like the form. I could paint you. Let me tell a story about you. Those are all experiential, and they're objectifying. And I think I love experience as much as the next person. Why? Of course. But I think the Buberian view of relation opens the door to a basement, to sort of a deeper level. It's almost Freudian.
Okay.
As to the sense in which other people count or other things count. Why does that count? Why does that count?
I think what's lovely is that the way you introduce, and I think it opens it up in a different way, the notion of I find myself caring about the turtle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that might cut across the tension between relation and experience, but caring, and then how important it is for us to stay open, be caring.
But, it's a distinction I only find in Buber. Maybe other people have found it elsewhere. Because as a culture, we're absolutely sure that experience is the beginning and the end. That this is, in my book, I call it experientialism.
Mm-hmm.
It's a belief that experience, and it's especially true among architects, by the way. Architects can have, ecological discussions of why their buildings should do this and that. But usually the bottom line is so that you can have a great experience, so that you can experience the space or experience the exhibits or experience it, right? So as soon as you say experience, you hit pay dirt. Like all you have to do now is describe the experience. And it's peculiarly empty of things like commitment, care, like maintenance of a building. And I'm not sure if the same's true in music, Artemis. It's like, if all you care about is experience, it's like, oh, well, how did that music make me feel? And if I can say how it made me feel and it was good, then I say it's a good piece of music. But, you have to, go ahead.
I mean, this is the legacy of the Romantics, isn't it?
It is, in a way, yeah.
With Johann, how this fantastic tradition of music as rhetoric has disappeared and reappeared at the end of the 20th century. So music as a rational form of dialogue is back and has been back for some some years. So yeah, absolutely. But again, in pop classical music and in experience culture, it is much more marketable to claim that democracy in music is that everyone can feel it rather than understand it or converse with it, come to.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, there was a question by José.
Okay, thank you. I will be very brief because we are late. So thank you, Michael, for your wonderful presentation. It's just a question, it's just a naive question, but for me it will be great if you can answer yes or no. There is any role that the Heidegger's text on Eduardo Chillida plays on your ontology of space?
Yeah, for architects, Heidegger is like the king of philosophers, because he wrote Building, Dwelling, Thinking. I think that was his essay. He's one of the very few architects, philosophers that ever addressed architecture. Funnily enough, Wittgenstein does too. In fact, Wittgenstein was an architect and built his own house. And a lot of his thinking is actually quite architectural, and inspired some other architects. But yeah, I have trouble with Heidegger myself, and I make a point of not quoting him if possible, for two reasons. One is my own family history, but the other is that I find him a mystagogue of the worst kind, and I just don't care to follow him. But I will say, among my friends that have read Heidegger and get value out of Heidegger, he does open up thinking about architecture to something deeper than, is this hallway wide enough, or how many stairs do we need, or can I get 35 cars into those parking spots, right? Or building codes. I mean, an architect's life, a practicing architect's life, is so absorbed in law and engineering and money, that it's quite a feat to maintain a spiritual or philosophical attitude towards what you're doing. And Heidegger really, really serves that purpose. For me, he's for architects anyway, a door to higher thinking about buildings. And but the emphasis is largely on experience for most Heidegger readers, and not on relations. So I will mention Heidegger when I teach, but I try pretty quickly to get to Buber.
Everyone is entitled not to read Heidegger, so that's good.
I exercise my right.
Exactly. Katrina writes that she is walking home listening but can't rejoin, but wanted to raise the issue of Marina Abramovic as experience culture. Her performance art could be said to solidify encounter into a spectacle, so a less sympathetic reading than the one that you were giving.
No, she's absolutely right. There's and in the book, which I hope Katrina picks up. Katrina, you have to buy my book. I do talk about the fact that performance art, one is always suspicious that performance artists are just looking for attention. It's just another way to get attention to themselves. Yeah. And that certainly things like The Artist is Present is very much a spectacle-based thing, which is why I raised the question of how important is it that there's an audience around there? Look at the theatrical lighting, and is this a genuine encounter? And I think my answer is, despite all the theater, despite all the machinery of theater, that actual encounter did happen. A little like a nuclear reactor. There actually was nuclear interaction between people. And I don't think that was acted. So it was like all that theater actually created non-theater. It created an authentic encounter.
Okay, Artemis gives us a link about the legendary mockumentary on the artist is present. I'm sure that we will enjoy.
A mockumentary, that's good.
We will very much enjoy looking at that. And I do think, your reference to the theater is interesting, and that links it back to Daniel in a way, which is also really about the encounter on the stage and how that is a kind of laboratory or experimental space. I think Goethe makes that point at the beginning of Dichtung und Wahrheit. I think that maybe that's what Buber is thinking of in Daniel, which at least that's how it resounded to me, where Goethe describes his experience of going into the theater, the door closes, the lights go out, and suddenly you're in a time and space away from time and space. And there something can happen in a kind of, like you say, in a nuclear reaction format. Mm-hmm. And that is transported into the stage there in that. So, but yeah, this is a very, very important point. I would like to also ask one question, and then maybe we should bring it to a close. That just interested me. You said sort of being an architect is an ethical thing. That interests me a lot. And Plato remarks somewhere that architects of all the artisans have an even bigger there's an even bigger need for them to be morally upright people, because the buildings that they build are around for such a long time, and people have to live in them and make use of them. So, and if you're a bastard as an architect, then these buildings are around all the time. What do you think of that argument?
Oh no, it's totally sound. Architects are in the profession of. I've often been interested in what it is that defines a profession, and the most, as opposed from any other occupation or a trade or a craft or a business. And I've always understood a profession to be when the client or your customer, quote unquote, cannot understand if you have done the best for them or have done the best. So because they don't have the connoisseurship to know whether you've done the best. So profession is to promise the client to be acting in their interest to the best of your ability. I think that's what one professes. Right? In a business, if you don't like my product, if you don't like my sausage, you go to another butcher. If you don't like my art, don't buy my painting. But so the market takes care of that. But in architecture, the market doesn't take care of it very efficiently, because when you do something ugly or bad or hurtful, it stays around long after you're gone and long after the people who commissioned the building have gone. And that means that the architect makes a very, very big promise. The promise is to the client who pays for it. The promise is to the people who are going to live in the building. The promise is to the people in the street, the people going to walk past it and use it. The promise is to the contractors who make it. So yeah, one has to operate, I'd say, 90% out of a large sense of ethicality, and 10% with regard to what's needed today on this piece of land. And architects constantly get into ethical dilemmas. Simple things like, no, that's too much to put on this land. No, you can't face those apartments at that wall. No, we need more landscape. No, those space standards are too small. No, that'll crack and break. No, because the pressures on you from government and developers is constantly to do less.
Okay.
Because the IU is broken. It's completely broken. The chain of IU is broken.
Right. Thanks very much, Michael. That's
Thank you, guys. Thank you. Sorry I had a little break.
No. We had a wonderful time, and I'm really, thanks. Let's applause once more. And so yeah, people have left now. That's fine. We're half an hour late, but I really enjoyed it, and I think the sessions today have really shown us in a way that's only beginning to emerge for me what this actuality of Buber consists in, and how very much he speaks to things that are current at the present time, in not only just in politics or in ethics, as we've seen, but also in culture and in art. the relation to the natural world is of course a very big theme, and I think that touches on several things, Michael, that you've been saying.
Yes.
And the relationship to the past and to what it means to build a society, to build a culture, is something that came across very strongly in what Artemis said. So I think that was a wonderful example of how these ideas of dialogue are perhaps re-emerging with a new significance for the present time, and that's really exciting. I'm very excited about that. I just wanted to say by way of closure, and then maybe I'll ask Vic to say a few words if you want to do that, Vic. So as I said in the beginning, I was thinking how to close this off. Of course, we're not going to close it off because we're going to have more meetings for the people who want to contribute to the special issue, and we will be sending emails out about that. And hopefully we're going to, at the Bloch Center and Institute of Modern Languages Research, we'll have a workshop which is likely going to be online as well later in the year, specifically on Paula Winkler. So I've spoken to a couple of people with some of them. One of them was there 2 sessions ago in our group who have written on Paula Winkler, and we're going to organize a workshop on her novels and essays. So keep you informed of that as well. And as I was reading Faith and Dissent, so Paul's book, I came to the end, the very end here. Paul quotes the moment late in the life of Buber where he was feted by the students of the Hebrew University, and they made him an honorary member of the student union. And then he has these words, and I thought they illustrate perfectly what we've been trying to do with the seminar. And we've seen so many great examples of this sort of almost a renewed sense, I feel, of what scholarship and thinking can contribute to the world. And we've started to explore these things in understanding Buber, and then looking at what does it mean, and how might this even have an influence on what we understand by academic and intellectual culture. And I thought it was so nice to read these words precisely, of course, also because he talks about a Dutch professor who actually has my name. So, and it was great, came from my university. It was great, great writer. There was a Dutch professor, Johan Huizinga, who wrote a book about the Homo Ludens, the playing man, someone who enjoys playfulness as an expression of freedom. That's a book actually from 1938. It's an old book, but it's beautiful to read. Buber then suggested, Paul writes, that analogously one might recognize what he called the naturally studying person, someone for whom learning and study are an expression of human freedom. Such a student is someone who aspires to know truth in order to build upon it a structure worthy for people to inhabit, whether that's a real building or some other building of ideas or practices. If this is your aspiration, I'm delighted you've made me a partner in it and by accepting me as a student in your association. And I think the naturally studying person, someone for whom learning and study are an expression of human freedom, that's also a way in which Buber is reinterpreting a big part of the Jewish tradition. And maybe in his own ways, sort of post-rabbinic Jewish faith, if you can call it that, probably you can. He expresses there an idea that is alive in Judaism, has been alive for a very long time, and that speaks in a radical way also to people who are not from that religious background or from that culture.
Cancel.
So I heard something there, but that's okay. So I just wanted to personally end on that, to say playing and study, these things have a lot to do with each other, and that can provide a new way for a more dialogical approach to what we do in the academy. And I think that this year, working in these weird circumstances which have allowed people to meet that otherwise probably would not have met, is quite a good example of how, under the duress of the circumstances, we found playful ways to experience studying as an expression of human freedom. So thank you all very much for the role that you've played in it and for spending the time with us. And I'm looking forward to what we're going to do in the future. That's what I wanted to say at the end. And Vic, maybe you have a few words as well.
Well, I just want to say that it's been lovely playing with everybody, and that we've been part of kind of creating what felt like an impossibility at the beginning, which was to create a kind of community in these terrible times. It's been a kind of very special space that somehow seems to have collected itself around just the conversations that we've been able to hold together. So it's been a precious moment. I'd love to be in the room with everybody so I could give people a real hug and say goodbye and thank you, and it's been wonderful. And I just hope that we can find ways of keeping this together in some kind of way. Just as an idea, and one of the joys of this has also been the dialogue that I've had with Johan, and I hadn't realized that Huizinga had gone to Johann's university. But that book about play, which I knew as a teenager, late teenager, and the Homo Ludens, the idea that intellectual life is also like playing, and that Buber has that. There's something alive in Buber that I think we've been able to both create and imagine in just the ways that we've been together. So one idea that we had was, if we carried on, though we just don't know, how we could carry on some of the discussion, possibly linking Buber back to Nietzsche and the influence of Nietzsche on Buber, but also Landau. Landau is a figure that's grown through this seminar in significance, both for Buber, but I think for all of us in some way. He's raised questions about relationships, but also connections that Buber had with Marx and with politics and with nature. And these feel really important. It feels like an important moment that we're in. And it would be lovely if we could find a way of both working together on this journal over the summer, but for people to not feel constrained, to feel kind of open to just suggest things. These aren't necessarily academic papers. They can be like 2,000 or 3,000 word pieces. They don't have to be, academically framed. They can be people's enthusiasms. They can be things that people have learned out of the time that we've been together and just wanting to write it up, or wanting to use some of the materials that have been produced. So it's a kind of open invitation. It's not like we're closing down and now just a few people should collect around the journal. The idea should be open for everybody in order to kind of shape ideas. So we did have the idea, I don't know whether, Johan, that by like the 1st of June or something, or the people
we've been talking about, and we said maybe by, I think we said by the 1st of May.
Yeah.
People who are interested in contributing, I'll put this all in email to the whole group, but by the 1st of May, people who are interested, please let us know that you would like to contribute. And as Vic said, this can be an academic article, but it can also be a different kind of reflection, and it can be shorter than that. We have a lot of freedom with the journal, how we do it. And then based on so maybe an expression of interest and a potential title, or a provisional title, and then we would then have several months after that for people to work on it, and we would organize some Zoom meetings where people can join if they wanted to talk about what they're thinking about. And then, what did we say as an end date or a submission date? I don't think we said 1st of June. I think it was 1st of September then, right?
We said 1st of September as a kind of writing target, so that it didn't stretch into whatever we might want to do the following year.
Yeah. So keep those dates in mind, and I will put them in an email, and then we're looking forward to hearing from you. Yeah. Okay, thanks, Vic. Thanks very much. So time to bring it to a close. Thanks again for your presence and your participation and your dialogue with us. And we will be in touch later on.
Thank you, Johan. Thank you, Vic, for putting a wonderful event together for all of us.